Namaste, and welcome to Chapter 2, Contents of the Gita Summarized. Due to Srila Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada's devotion and his perseverance, the Bhagavad Gita has become revered all over the world. In 1953, he established the League of Devotees in India and based the program on the study and the preaching of the Bhagavad Gita. But it was in 1968 that he published the Bhagavad Gita as it is for the world to discover, and indeed it did. In the preface he wrote, "Krishna is absolute, and there is no difference between Krishna's name, Krishna's form, Krishna's quality, Krishna's pastimes, etc. This absolute position of Krishna is difficult to understand for any person who is not a devotee of Krishna in the Parampara system." So let us look at an overview now for Chapter 2. Many of the acharyas in our Parampara explain that this chapter is a summary of the whole Gita. The main theme of Chapter 2 is, who are you? Who am I? It's about your spiritual identity as the eternal living entity, the Jiva Atma. Now, previously in Chapter 1, we witnessed Arjuna's lamentation. And now in Chapter 2, he continues to express his distress and confusion. Krishna addresses the cause of that lamentation by explaining the foundations of our spiritual identity. In verse 2, Sanjaya says, Shri Bhagavan Uvacha, the Supreme Person, Bhagavan, says. The acharyas pinpoint this as the beginning for the Bhagavad Gita, because here Krishna is addressed as the Supreme Personality of Godhead, as Bhagavan, the Absolute Truth. And in verse 7, this marks the beginning of the personal journey for the reader of Bhagavad Gita, because here it is that Arjuna asks for help. And we can relate to this in our own individual predicaments and our necessity for shelter. Because there are 72 verses in Chapter 2, I have divided it into 9 segments. So let us now begin with segment 1, which are verses 1 to 3. These opening verses for this entire chapter begin with Sanjaya informing the blind king that at this point Krishna now responds to Arjuna's dilemma. Verse 1, Sanjaya said, seeing Arjuna full of compassion and very sorrowful, his eyes brimming with tears, Madhusudan, Krishna, spoke the following words. Verse 2, the Supreme Person, Bhagavan, said, my dear Arjuna, how have these impurities come upon you? They are not at all befitting a man who knows the progressive values of life. They do not lead to higher planets, but to infamy. Now for segment 2, which are verses 4 to 6. In response to what Krishna has just said to him, Arjuna presented a couple of more arguments, more or less his final arguments. Verse 4, Arjuna said, O killer of Madhu, Krishna, how can I counterattack with arrows in battle men like Bhishma and Drona who are worthy of my worship? So now segment 3, which are verses 7 to 10. And this is verse 7, which we noted before, the famous point at which Arjuna ceases to present his own arguments and surrenders to Krishna. Now I am confused about my duty and have lost all composure because of weakness. In this condition, I am asking you to tell me clearly what is best for me. Now I am your disciple and a soul surrendered unto you. Please instruct me. Segment 4, which are verses 11 to 30. At this point, Krishna presents many verses on the analytical study of the material body and the nature of the spirit soul, Sankhya Yoga. And this is just magical. There is nowhere else you will find such a wonderful collection of descriptions of this soul. Verse 13. As the embodied soul continually passes in this body from boyhood to youth to old age, the soul similarly passes into another body at death. The self-realized soul is not bewildered by such a change. Verse 20. For the soul there is never birth nor death, nor having once been does he ever cease to be. He is unborn, eternal, ever existing, undying, and primeval. He is not slain when the body is slain. Verse 22. As a person puts on new garments, giving up old ones, similarly the soul accepts new material bodies, giving up the old and useless ones. Verse 23. The soul can never be cut into pieces by any weapon, nor can he be burned by fire, nor moistened by water, nor withered by the wind. So we move on to segment 5, which cover verses 31 to 38. So Krishna has given knowledge, descriptions of the soul and the body, and he next explains to Arjuna his duty as a warrior. With this, he briefly discusses Karma Yoga. Verse 31. Considering your specific duty as a kshatriya, you should know that there is no better engagement for you than fighting on religious principles. And so there is no need for hesitation. So we're up to segment 6, which covers verses 39 to 53, quite a few verses. And in verse 39, Krishna touches upon working without fruitive results, and instead working for the satisfaction of the Lord only. In other words, he now gives a glimpse into bhaktiyoga, which is the heart of the Bhagavad Gita. Verse 39. Thus far I have declared to you the analytical knowledge of Sankhya philosophy. Now listen to the knowledge of yoga, whereby one works without fruitive result. O son of Pritha, when you act by such intelligence, you can free yourself from the bondage of works. Verse 44. In the minds of those who are too attached to sense enjoyment and material opulence, and who are bewildered by such things, the resolute determination of devotional service to the Supreme Lord does not take place. Verse 49. O Dhananjaya, rid yourself of all fruitive activities by devotional service, and surrender fully to that consciousness. Those who want to enjoy the fruits of their work are misers. Verse 51. The wise engaged in devotional service, take refuge in the Lord and free themselves from the cycle of birth and death by renouncing the fruits of action in the material world. In this way, they can attain that state beyond all miseries. Segment 7, which cover verses 54 to 61. Now, the Bhagavad Gita is a very practical book, and Arjuna now asks Krishna a very practical question. He wanted to hear about the perfect role model, and Krishna describes the symptoms of such a person. This is wonderful to hear. In verse 54, Arjuna said, "What are the symptoms of one whose consciousness is thus merged in transcendence? How does he speak? And what is his language? How does he sit? And how does he walk?" So Krishna is going to reply. So verse 56, "One who is not disturbed in spite of the threefold miseries, who is not elated when there is happiness, and who is free from attachment, fear, and anger, is called a sage of steady mind." Verse 58, "One who is able to withdraw his senses from sense objects, as the tortoise draws his limbs within the shell, is to be understood as truly situated in knowledge." Verse 61, "One who restrains his senses and fixes his consciousness upon me is known as a man of steady intelligence." So now in segment 8, verses 62 to 70, Krishna is going to speak more. He's going to add to this understanding of controlling the senses, how important that is. Verse 62, "While contemplating the objects of the senses, a person develops attachment for them, and from such attachment lust develops, and from lust anger arises." Verse 63, "From anger delusion arises, and from delusion bewilderment of memory. When memory is bewildered, intelligence is lost. And when intelligence is lost, one falls down again into the material pool." Verse 67, a beautiful analogy. "As a boat on the water is swept away by strong wind, even one of the senses on which the mind focuses can carry away a man's intelligence." So now we're up to the final segment, segment 9, verses 71 to 72. And these concluding verses are called the peace formula. Verse 71, "A person who has given up all desires for sense gratification, who lives free from desires and has given up all sense of proprietorship and is devoid of false ego, he alone can attain real peace." And finally, verse 72, "That is the way of the spiritual and godly life, after attaining which a man is not bewildered. Being so situated, even at the hour of death, one can enter the kingdom of God." So, for a summary of chapter 2, Krishna depicted Sankhya Yoga, analysing the nature of the material body and the Jiva Atma, the spirit soul. He gives an indication of Karma Yoga. He gives a glimpse into Bhakti Yoga. And he speaks about the symptoms of a liberated person. And finally, why we should control the senses. So it is really a magnificent summary of very deep points, very valuable for our life. So until we meet for chapter 3, Namaste.